In this lecture, I'll provide an overview of this week's readings, which speak to issues of agency and power in women's writing. In March 1776, Abigail Adams wrote her husband, John Adams, that the revolutionary leaders soon to meet in Philadelphia in the Second Continental Congress needed to remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. She warned, perhaps somewhat playfully, that if women are ignored, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. 4 months later, on July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Independence, authored by Thomas Jefferson, which enunciated one of the founding ideals of the new nation, namely that all men are created equal. But by men, did Jefferson and his compatriots mean all men, all humans, or all white men? The persistence of slavery and the failure over the next several decades and more to give women equal political rights suggests that the revolutionaries' assertion of equality addressed white men only. But universal ideas of equality remained central to the Revolutionary Age. In 1790, the Massachusetts writer Judith Sargent Murray published On the Equality of the Sexes, arguing that women should have equal access to education. 2 years later, inspired by the egalitarian ideals of the French Revolution, the British political philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft published The Vindication of the Rights of Women, a wide-ranging critique of the subjugation of women. Like Murray, Wollstonecraft insisted that women should have equal opportunities for education, and she went even further in proclaiming that women should have the same social, legal, and political privileges available to most men. But change came slowly. During the first half of the 19th century, and well beyond, American women lacked the right to vote. They had limited access to education, and virtually no access to higher education. Women who married had no rights to their own property, and no legal authority to make contracts on their own. If a married woman earned money, that money belonged to her husband. Divorce was a near impossibility if the husband refused to grant it. White women were hardly enslaved, but in terms of their legal rights, they were regarded as something like chattel. It's not surprising, then, that the anti-slavery and women's rights movements of the antebellum period had significant overlaps. Both reform movements contested patriarchal authority, and both championed the Declaration of Independence's ideal of equality for men and women alike, regardless of color. The first anti-slavery convention of American women, which was an interracial convention, convened in Philadelphia in 1837. But at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840, the male organizers sought to exclude such leading U.S. feminists as Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. That snubbing set Mott and Stanton on the path to planning the first women's rights convention in the United States, which met in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, and approved a Declaration of Equal Rights for Women. The Seneca Falls Convention contributed to the women's rights activism that led various states to adopt Married Women's Property Acts, legislation that allowed married women to own property and keep their own wages. But the right to vote remained elusive, not to be obtained until 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. This week, we'll read a poem, a speech, an excerpt from a domestic manual, several short stories, political documents, and excerpts from an autobiography and a novel. Through all of these works, we'll be thinking about how the act of writing itself can be taken as a desire for female agency. the question of how agency and power are manifested in the written word will open up these and other texts by women from the 19th century. Analyzing agency and power in these texts does not necessarily require additional outside research, as the texts themselves describe, either explicitly or implicitly, the circumstances that either constrain or enable women's agency and power. This is where you should focus your attention, on those moments when the text itself identifies the limited conditions for agency that the author has to work within and against to claim some degree of power, and then deploys creative use of language in order to do so. To guide your reading, it will be helpful to keep the following questions in mind. What spaces for agency are available for the author? What limitations on her agency does she describe, and what possibilities for exercising agency does she propose? What are the specific words or phrases that the author uses to describe those spaces for agency? Be as specific as possible here, as you will probably get a general sense of where the author is coming from on an initial read-through, but it's important to pinpoint the exact language that the author uses, as the author's strategies for claiming her power will depend on how she describes possible spaces for agency to begin with. How does the author use language in a creative or rhetorical way to claim power for herself and/or other women? Be as specific as possible in looking for examples. Now, this week's reading begins with 4 key texts from the women's rights movement of the pre-Civil War period. Sarah Louisa Fortin Purvis's poem, inspired by the 1837 Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Declaration of Sentiments, which was adopted by the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. And Sojourner Truth's speech, delivered at an 1851 Women's Rights Convention. Along with this, we'll be reading a selection from Catherine E. Beecher's popular 1843 Domestic Manual, Treatise on Domestic Economy. Now, just a warning, you might be a bit taken aback by this work because by instructing women on how to be good daughters, wives, and mothers, Beecher's work seems to go against the grain of other more clearly feminist works from this period. Beecher, to some extent, accepts and promulgates the 19th century ideology of separate spheres, that is, the idea that women belong in the home and men in the world, which is the very idea that other feminists like Stanton contest. But Beecher placed a special emphasis on the influence that women could exert from within the home to change the world, and thus, in her own way, she asserted the importance of female power. With the work of Angelina Grimke and Harriet Jacobs, we'll be entering more directly into the intersections between the abolitionist and the suffrage movements. Grimke's piece is an abolitionist essay intended to appeal to the Christian sentiments of white Southern women, while Jacobs' autobiography is a powerful statement of the vulnerability inherent in being both a woman and an enslaved person. Finally, the work of popular writer Fanny Fern's domestic work shows how the politics of women's rights had become central to magazine stories and novels of the 1850s. The haunting excerpt from Fern's best-selling novel, Ruth Hall, which tells the story of a woman seemingly driven mad by a tyrannical husband, suggests that much work remained to be done by reformist and writing women in the years to come.